At my wife's funeral, my daughter-in-law leaned close enough for only me to hear and whispered, "She's gone now, so the $400,000 house is finally ours." For a second, I thought grief had twisted her words. Then she smiled. "You should start packing before this gets ugly." My son stood beside her in a black suit worth more than my first car, staring at the church carpet like it could save him from speaking. He heard every word, and he said nothing. I was 74 years old, still wearing my wedding ring, still holding the marigolds my wife loved. And suddenly, I understood something colder than death. Some people don't wait for the grave to close before they start measuring the living room. I almost crushed the flowers in my hand. Instead, I told her quietly, "My wife is not a lock you waited to hear click open." That was when Pastor Abel walked toward me carrying a small cedar box. "Ferran," he said softly, "Alma asked me to give you this only if they mentioned the house too soon." On the lid, in my wife's handwriting, were 7 words that changed everything. "If they speak of the house first, open this. Welcome to Final Act Revenge." Before I tell you what was inside that box, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are tonight. And please don't forget to take care of your health while listening. Some betrayals arrive when people are already carrying more grief than they can survive alone. I still remember how cold that cedar box felt in my hands, because deep down, I already knew my wife had seen this coming before I did. I'm Ferran Torres, 74 years old, retired public school history teacher, former debate coach, husband for 41 years to a woman named Alma who could silence a room without ever raising her voice. Most people who passed our house on West Magnolia Avenue would never think twice about it. 2 bedrooms, faded brick, a pecan tree in the backyard that dropped branches every spring like it was angry at gravity itself. The kitchen tiles never sat perfectly level. The porch light only worked if you hit the switch twice. But Alma loved that house the way some people love churches. We bought it in 1986 for $83,000 after saving for nearly 4 years. I still remember signing the mortgage papers with a pen chained to the banker's desk, while Alma squeezed my knee under the table because my hands were shaking. Back then, I was teaching American history at Jefferson High in San Antonio. Alma worked as the school librarian. We weren't poor, but every dollar already had a destination before it reached our checking account. There were years we survived on soup, discount bread, and teacher overtime checks. Still, Alma planted marigolds beside the front porch every spring. "People deserve something beautiful when they come home," she used to say. That house became more than walls. It became Mateo learning to ride a bicycle in the driveway, debate students practicing speeches in our living room, Alma letting neighborhood kids borrow books during summer because the public library closed early on weekends, Christmas dinners where folding chairs stretched all the way into the hallway, quiet nights where Alma fell asleep grading reading logs beside me while old jazz played from the kitchen radio. Even now, I can still hear her slippers against the hardwood floor if the house gets quiet enough. That's why Brina never understood what she was trying to take. To her, the place had good resale bones. I remember the first time she said that. Alma had just come home from another hospital appointment in late 2022. She was thinner by then, tired, easier, but still stubborn enough to argue with doctors twice her size. Brina stood in the living room turning slowly in a circle like she was studying inventory. "You know," she said casually, "houses in Beacon Hill are exploding right now. This place could probably sell for over 400 grand if somebody modernized the kitchen." Alma smiled politely. But later that night, while I was watering the marigolds outside, she stepped onto the porch beside me and asked something strange. "If I go first someday, promise me you won't sign anything while you're grieving." I laughed because I thought she was being dramatic. "Alma," I told her, "nobody's taking this house." She looked at me for a long moment, not angry, not afraid, just disappointed in how badly I wanted to believe that. "You always see the best in Mateo," she said quietly. Then she touched my wedding ring with her thumb. "And sometimes, love makes people slow to notice when they're being cornered." At the time, I thought she was talking about hospital bills, or stress, or fear. Now I know my wife had already started seeing something I refused to look at directly. After the funeral, I sat alone in the kitchen with the cedar box Pastor Abel gave me. The whole house smelled faintly like flower arrangements and old coffee from the reception trays people had dropped off earlier. I stared at Alma's handwriting on the lid again. If they speak of the house first, open this. Outside, a truck rolled slowly past the house and stopped near the curb for a second before moving again. At first, I thought nothing of it. Then I noticed the magnetic logo on the driver's door, Moss Premier Realty. And suddenly, Alma's warning no longer sounded emotional. It sounded specific. The strange thing about funerals is how quickly people return to ordinary behavior once the food arrives. An hour after Alma's burial, relatives were balancing paper plates on their knees inside the fellowship hall at St. Mercy Chapel. Somebody's grandson was laughing too loudly near the coffee station. Folding chairs scraped across the tile floor. A woman I barely knew kept touching my shoulder every 3 minutes, like grief was something you could pat into submission. Meanwhile, my wife had been gone less than half a day. Brina moved through the room like she was hosting a networking event instead of mourning someone who once treated her like family. She carried trays, hugged distant cousins, smiled at church members. Every sentence sounded polished enough to belong in a real estate commercial. We just want what's safest for Ferran now. That house is too much for one man. Alma would never want him alone in there. People nodded because the words sounded caring if you didn't listen too closely. That's how manipulation works when it wears good manners. Mateo stayed near the coffee urn most of the afternoon. He kept crushing the rim of his paper cup with his thumb until it bent inward. I noticed because Alma used to do the same thing whenever she was nervous and trying not to argue. 3 different times I caught him opening his mouth like he wanted to say something. 3 different times he chose silence instead. At one point, Pastor Abel walked beside me and lowered his voice. "Are you all right, Ferran?" "No," I answered honestly. He nodded slowly like a man who appreciated truth more than performance. Across the room, Brina was speaking with a woman from the church choir. "The market in Beacon Hill is unbelievable right now," she said softly. "Honestly, timing matters with older homes." Timing. That word hit me harder than I expected. Not grief, not loss. Timing. Like Alma's death had quietly become a scheduling opportunity. I walked toward Brina before I fully realized I'd decided to move. She looked surprised when I stopped beside her. "Did you need something, Ferran?" Her tone was sweet enough to rot your teeth. I glanced toward Mateo. He stared at the floor again. I asked her calmly, "Why are we discussing real estate at my wife's funeral?" The room didn't go silent dramatically like movies pretend it does. Real life is messier. Forks still scraped plates. Somebody coughed near the hallway, but the people closest to us stopped pretending not to listen. Brina crossed her arms lightly. "I'm discussing your future. My future still includes my wife," I said. She gave me that same thin smile from earlier. "And your future also includes reality." I think that was the moment something inside me finally shifted. Not anger exactly, something colder, like a door quietly locking from the inside. Mateo stepped closer then. "Dad, not today." 4 words. That was all my son gave me while his wife discussed my home like estate inventory. Not today. Not, "Brina, stop." Not, "Dad, I'm sorry." Not, "This isn't appropriate." Just enough resistance to sound decent, and not enough to actually protect me. I looked at him for a long time. Then I said quietly, "You sound more worried about conflict than cruelty." Mateo's face tightened, but Brina answered before he could. "We're trying to help you make practical decisions before grief clouds your judgment." There it was again, practical. Every greedy person eventually hides behind that word because it sounds responsible. I started noticing details after that. Little things. Tiny cracks in behavior Alma probably saw long before I did. Brina had a leather folder tucked under her arm all afternoon. At first, I assumed it held funeral paperwork. But when she sat it down near the dessert table, the corner opened slightly. Inside was a glossy brochure. Luxury Senior Condominiums, North San Antonio. I felt sick immediately, not because of the brochure itself, because nobody prints those things the same morning they bury your wife. That meant conversations had already happened. Plans, timelines, assumptions. And suddenly Alma's warning on the cedar box no longer felt emotional. It felt prepared. I left the fellowship hall earlier than most people noticed. Outside, the Texas air carried that dry evening chill. San Antonio gets in late March. The church parking lot was half empty by then. I had just reached my truck when I heard footsteps behind me. "Grandpa?" It was Talia. My granddaughter looked terrified. Somebody would see her talking to me alone. She glanced back toward the church doors before stepping closer. "Grandma told me not to let Mom throw things away." The sentence hit me so strangely, I almost didn't answer. "Throw what away?" Talia swallowed hard. "The papers in the sewing room." Then she pressed something small into my hand. A brass key. Before I could speak again, she whispered, "Grandma said you'd know when to use it." And then she hurried back inside before her parents noticed she was gone. I didn't open the cedar box right away after coming home from the funeral. For nearly an hour, it sat in the middle of the kitchen table while the house settled into the kind of silence that only exists after someone dies inside it. The refrigerator hummed softly. Pipes clicked somewhere behind the walls. Outside, a dog barked 3 houses down before everything went quiet again. Alma used to fill silence without trying. The sound of turning book pages, her humming while watering plants, the way she talked to herself while cooking, like she was narrating a television show nobody else could hear. Now the house sounded abandoned, even with me still inside it. I finally sat down and pulled the cedar box closer. The wood smelled faintly like old closets and church pews. Alma loved cedar, said it kept important things safe from time. My hands shook harder than I expected when I lifted the lid. Inside wasn't jewelry, or photographs, or some sentimental goodbye letter meant to comfort a grieving husband. It was organized. That frightened me immediately. There was a small brass key wrapped in cloth, a folded letter, an old photograph of our house from 1986, a USB drive with masking tape labeled simply "for Ferran only." And beneath everything else, a sheet of paper with one sentence written in Alma's handwriting. "Do not let grief sign what love protected." I read that line 3 times. Then I opened the letter. "Ferran, if you are reading this, they spoke about the house before they properly mourned me. I prayed I was wrong. I need you to understand something difficult. I did not hide these things because I doubted your intelligence. I hid them because I know your heart. You always believe Mateo will eventually choose courage if given enough time. But grief makes good people easy to corner." The room felt colder after that. Alma continued. "There are documents in my sewing room. Use the brass key for the lower cabinet drawer. And before you trust anyone who suddenly speaks about helping you, ask Pilar what she saw on Tuesday morning." I stopped reading there, not because I wanted to, because suddenly I remembered something I hadn't thought about in months. One Tuesday morning last year, Alma had looked out the front window for almost 10 straight minutes without speaking. At the time, I assumed she was tired from treatment. Now I wondered who she had been watching. I carried the brass key down the hallway toward Alma's sewing room. That room still looked exactly the way she left it. Half-finished blue fabric folded beside the machine. Reading glasses near a stack of library donation forms. A yellow sticky note reminding herself to call a parent about overdue books. Even dying, Alma was still helping children return library books. I sat on the edge of her sewing chair for a moment before opening the lower cabinet. The brass key fit perfectly. Inside was a thick accordion folder, not random papers, carefully arranged records, repair invoices, property tax copies, insurance documents, handwritten notes, printouts from real estate websites, one business card from a woman named Kendra Moss at Moss Premier Realty. Then I found something that made my stomach tighten. A printed estimate labeled Pre-Listing Property Consultation. Date, 11 days before Alma died. I read it twice because my brain refused to accept the timing. There were notes in the margin. Kitchen modernization potential. Excellent neighborhood appreciation. Widower transition likely. Widower transition. Like my marriage had already become a scheduling category. I leaned back slowly in Alma's chair and stared at the papers scattered across my lap. That was the moment the grief finally mixed with something else. Not rage, recognition. Because Alma hadn't prepared this box for a confused old man who might struggle financially after losing his wife. She prepared it for a husband whose family was already circling the house before the cemetery flowers even wilted. Then I noticed another sticky note clipped behind the estimate. 3 words, "Ask Pilar directly." And beneath that, one final sentence written shakily in Alma's handwriting. "I think Brina brought someone to measure the house while you were visiting me at the hospital." I felt physically sick after reading it, not because the sentence surprised me anymore, because deep down, part of me already believed it. Then, from outside the house, I heard a car slow down near the curb again. I moved carefully toward the living room window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see. A dark SUV sat across the street for several seconds. On the passenger door was the same logo I noticed after the funeral, Moss Premier Realty. And this time, somebody inside the vehicle was taking pictures of my house. I barely slept after seeing that SUV outside my house. Every sound felt suspicious after midnight. Tires slowing near the curb, a gate closing somewhere down the block, wind pushing branches across the roof. Grief already makes a person feel exposed, but once you realize somebody may be waiting for you to collapse, even ordinary silence starts sounding dangerous. The next morning, I walked across the street to Pilar Nunez's house, carrying Alma's note in my coat pocket. Pilar had lived opposite us since 1991. Retired art teacher, sharp eyes, sharper opinions. The kind of woman who noticed if somebody changed curtain colors from half a block away. Alma trusted her, which meant I should have listened to her years earlier. Pilar opened the door before I knocked twice. One look at my face, and she sighed softly. "So," she said, stepping aside, "Alma finally made you ask." That sentence alone nearly broke me. Her living room smelled like cinnamon coffee and paint thinner. Half-finished watercolor landscapes leaned against the walls beside stacks of gardening magazines. A tiny ceramic rooster sat near the television wearing sunglasses somebody had drawn on with marker. Normally, Alma would have laughed at that rooster for at least 5 straight minutes. Instead, I stood there feeling 80 years old. Pilar handed me coffee without asking how I took it. "Sit down, Ferran." I stayed standing. "What did you see?" She studied me for a long moment before answering. 11 days before Alma passed, Brina brought 2 men to your house while you were at the hospital." The room suddenly felt smaller. "One carried a laser tape measure," Pilar continued. "The other kept taking exterior photos." I looked away toward the window because I couldn't bear watching another person describe strangers examining my home while my wife was dying. Pilar noticed anyway. "I wanted to call you," she said quietly, "but Alma asked me not to unless things got ugly after the funeral." I laughed once, not because anything was funny, because hearing the word after felt ridiculous now. Ugly had started long before Alma died. Pilar sat across from me and lowered her coffee mug carefully onto the table. "Brina was talking on the phone near your driveway," she said. "I couldn't hear every word, but I heard enough." My stomach tightened. "What did she say?" Pilar repeated it slowly. "The widow timeline may move faster than expected." I closed my eyes immediately. Then Pilar added another sentence. "If he resists, we frame it as safety." There it was. Not concern, not family support. Strategy. Every warm word Brina used after the funeral suddenly sounded rehearsed. Pilar leaned back in her chair. "I'm retired, Ferran, but my curtains still work full-time." That actually pulled a tired smile out of me for the first time in days. Alma used to say Pilar knew more neighborhood secrets than the city government. Then Pilar's face turned serious again. "There's more." She stood up, walked to a cabinet near the hallway, and returned carrying a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Alma's handwriting. My chest tightened instantly. How long have you had this? Since January. January. That meant Alma had already been preparing months before the funeral. Pilar handed me the envelope carefully. She told me only to give it to you if Brina started discussing the house too soon. The phrase too soon almost made me angry. There should never have been a right time. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was another short handwritten note from Alma. Ferran, if you are reading this, then I was right to worry. Please understand something. I tried warning you twice last year, but every time I mentioned Brina's behavior, you defended Matteo before I could finish speaking. I could not spend my final months forcing you to choose between your wife and your son while I was dying. So instead, I prepared. I stopped reading because my vision blurred for a second. That sentence hurt more than Brina's cruelty, because Alma was right. I remembered every conversation now. Every moment I dismissed her concerns because I wanted peace more than truth. Pilar reached across the table and touched my wrist gently. You loved your son, she said. No, I answered quietly. I loved the version of him I thought still existed. The house stayed silent for several seconds after that. Then Pilar spoke again. There's something else Alma wanted you to check. She handed me another folded paper. This one wasn't handwritten. It was a printed screenshot from the San Antonio City Permit portal. At the top was my address. Below it, an inquiry request for property evaluation access. Requester name, Brina Torres. Date submitted, 5 days before Alma died. I stared at the paper so long, the words almost stopped looking real. 5 days. My wife still had hospital bracelets on her wrist, while my daughter-in-law was already filing property inquiries. Pilar watched my face carefully. I'm sorry, Ferran. I nodded once, but couldn't speak. Outside her window, I could see my house across the street. The marigolds near the porch had started bending sideways from lack of watering. Alma always cared for them before sunrise. Then something caught my attention near the curb. A dark SUV rolled slowly past my house again. Same vehicle, same Moss Premier Realty logo. But this time, it didn't keep driving. It parked half a block away, and a woman stepped out carrying a camera. The woman with the camera stayed outside my house for almost 20 minutes. Not once did she knock on the door. She photographed the front porch, the driveway, the side fence Alma spent 2 summers repainting by hand because she refused to hire men who rush brushstrokes. Then she crouched near the flower beds and took pictures of the marigolds. That part nearly made me walk outside. Not because of the flowers themselves, because Alma planted those marigolds the week before Matteo was born. Every spring afterward, she replanted them no matter how sick, busy, or exhausted she felt. To Alma, they meant continuity. To strangers with cameras, they meant curb appeal. Pilar watched quietly beside me through the living room curtain. You should document this, she said. I nodded slowly. But the truth was, I still hadn't fully accepted that my own family might truly be planning around my grief. That's the dangerous thing about betrayal from people you love. Evidence arrives long before acceptance does. I crossed back to my house after lunch. The dark SUV was gone by then, but the feeling remained. Like somebody had entered the emotional boundaries of my life without permission. Inside the kitchen, Alma's cedar box still sat open on the table beside the sewing room papers. I spent most of the afternoon going through documents, property estimates, repair histories, insurance notes, mortgage payoff confirmations from years earlier. Alma organized everything with color tabs and handwritten labels because she believed confusion was expensive. At the bottom of the folder, I found another sheet from Moss Premier Realty. This one was worse. Projected listing preparation timeline. Week 1, property assessment. Week 2, family transition. Conversation, week 3, cleaning/staging. Week 4, market entry. I stared at those words for so long, my eyes started burning. Family transition conversation. That was what they called it now. not a widower losing the last place his wife ever laughed. A transition. My phone rang before I could calm down. Matteo. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. Dad? His voice sounded tired, hesitant. For a second, I heard the little boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms. Then Brina spoke somewhere in the background, and the feeling vanished. Matteo cleared his throat. Brina and I were thinking maybe we could stop by tomorrow, help organize some things. Organize what? A pause. You know, paperwork, storage, maybe talk about options. Options. Everybody suddenly loved that word too. I walked toward the sink slowly, gripping the edge hard enough for my knuckles to pale. Your mother has been dead for 3 days. I know, Dad. No, I said quietly. You know she's gone. That's not the same thing. Silence. Then Matteo lowered his voice. You shouldn't stay alone in that house forever. There it was again. That house. Never home. Never your mother's garden. Never the kitchen where she taught neighborhood kids to read. Just that house. I asked him something Alma once asked me. Are these your words? Or Brina's? Matteo exhaled sharply. Why are you turning this into a fight? That sentence hit harder than yelling would have, because it meant the problem to him wasn't cruelty. It was discomfort. I ended the call before I said something unforgivable. About an hour later, Brina texted me directly. Not condolences, not concern. A link. Luxury senior living residences. Limited availability. Below it, she wrote, You deserve peace, Farhan. The house is too much responsibility now. We're only trying to help you make smart decisions before grief clouds things further. I read the message 3 times, then once more out loud because sometimes hearing manipulation spoken aloud makes it easier to recognize. Help. Smart decisions. Peace. Every selfish plan sounds compassionate once somebody edits the language enough. I opened my laptop after dinner and typed my address into the city permit portal Alma mentioned. At first I thought maybe I misunderstood the documents. Then the search results loaded. Multiple inquiries. Roof inspection estimate, exterior evaluation request, foundation consultation, pre-sale zoning review, all tied to my address, all submitted within 6 weeks of Alma's final hospital stay. My chest tightened so suddenly I had to sit down. One inquiry included contact information, Kendra Moss. Without giving myself time to reconsider, I called the number. A receptionist answered cheerfully. Moss Premier Realty. I almost hung up. Instead, I asked carefully, Can you tell me why my property has pending review requests? Typing sounds clicked in the background. Then the woman replied casually, Oh, the Torres property. We currently have that listed internally as a pending family transition situation. Internally listed. Like my wife's death had already become a future sales category in somebody's office database. I ended the call immediately. For a long time, I just sat there staring at Alma's reading glasses beside the sewing machine across the hallway. Then something else caught my eye. An unfinished email draft open on Alma's old desktop computer. Subject line, House protection if Farhan is pressured. My heartbeat slowed almost painfully. The email was addressed to someone named Soren Vale, estate attorney. Most of the message was incomplete, but one sentence remained visible on the screen. If Brina accelerates after the funeral, Farhan will need the trust documents immediately. Trust documents. Not might. Will. That was the moment I finally understood something terrifying. Alma hadn't been paranoid. She had been preparing for impact. I copied down Soren Vale's office number with shaking hands. Then I called. The receptionist answered softly. I gave my name. There was a pause. Then she said something that made the entire room suddenly feel colder. Mr. Vale told us, if you ever called after Alma passed away, we should schedule you immediately. Soren Vale's office sat on the 7th floor of an old downtown building overlooking San Antonio Riverwalk traffic. The lobby smelled faintly like leather folders and burnt coffee. Quiet. Expensive. The kind of place where people signed paper that changed entire bloodlines without raising their voices. I arrived 15 minutes early because I barely slept the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Alma sitting alone in hospital rooms while strangers discussed family transition timelines around our home. That sentence still made me sick. A receptionist led me into Soren's office exactly at 9. He was older than I expected. Mid-60s maybe, silver hair, navy suspenders, calm eyes that looked like they had spent decades watching families destroy themselves politely. He stood when I entered. "Mr. Torres?" His handshake was firm, but not performative. Then he glanced toward the cedar box under my arm. "So," he said quietly, "Alma's timing was correct." Hearing someone talk about my wife like she was still actively protecting me almost broke something inside my chest. Soren motioned toward the chair across from his desk. "I'm sorry for your loss, Farhan." Unlike everyone else lately, he actually sounded sincere. I sat down slowly. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Soren opened a thick folder already waiting on the desk. "Your wife came to see me 6 times over the last 3 years." 6 times. I stared at him. "She never told me." "She didn't want to," he answered carefully. That hurt more than I expected. Not because Alma hid something from me, because part of me already understood why. Soren slid a document across the desk. At the top, in bold print, were words I had never seen before. "Torres Home Preservation Trust." My heartbeat slowed. "What is this?" Soren folded his hands. "In 2021, you and Alma transferred the house into a protected family trust structure." I frowned immediately. "No, I would remember that." "You signed during her second treatment cycle," he replied gently. "There were multiple estate documents processed together." And suddenly fragments returned. A hospital week, exhaustion, insurance paperwork. Alma holding my wrist while I signed forms because I could barely focus after sleeping in waiting rooms for days. Dear God. I looked down at my own signature on the trust papers. Real, legal, permanent. Soren continued calmly. "The trust grants you lifetime occupancy rights. Nobody can pressure, manipulate, or remove you from the property while you are alive." I leaned back slowly, trying to absorb the words. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. "And any beneficiary who attempts coercion regarding the house automatically risks suspension from future property interests." The room went completely still. Brina's smiling face flashed through my mind. The condo brochures, the permit inquiries, the photographs outside my home. Alma knew, not suspected. Knew. I swallowed hard. Why didn't she tell me directly? Soren didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened another envelope and handed me a letter. Alma's handwriting again. "Farhan, I tried warning you twice in 2023. Both times, you defended Mateo before I could finish speaking. I realized telling you everything directly would force you to choose between your wife and your son while I was already dying. I loved you too much to leave you with that guilt before my final days. So instead, I prepared quietly. I stopped reading because my eyes burned too badly. That was Alma. Even while protecting herself, she worried about protecting me from pain, too." Soren waited respectfully before speaking again. "Your wife was extraordinarily thorough." "That sounds nicer than paranoid," I muttered. To my surprise, Soren almost smiled. "No," he said softly. "Paranoid people invent danger. Alma documented it." Then he opened another section of the file. Inside were printed screenshots, city permit inquiries, property consultations, Moss, Premier, realty estimates, timeline notes, every piece connected. "This trust includes specific language Alma insisted we add," Soren explained. "If family members attempted to leverage grief, medical vulnerability, or emotional pressure to accelerate a property transfer, protections activate automatically." My throat tightened. She expected this after the funeral? "She expected the possibility," he corrected carefully. Then he reached into the folder again. "There's something else you need to know." He handed me a typed memo. "Trigger condition. Cedar box release. If discussions regarding property ownership occur within 48 hours following funeral services, Pastor Abel is authorized to release protected materials immediately. I stared at the page. The cedar box itself was part of Alma's legal strategy, not symbolism, evidence control. Suddenly, every moment after the funeral rearranged itself in my mind, like broken glass settling into place. Brina whispering about the house, Pastor Abel approaching with the box, Mateo staying silent. All of it activated something Alma had prepared months earlier. I rubbed both hands across my face slowly. I don't know whether to feel grateful or heartbroken. Soren nodded once. That usually means the person loved you honestly. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Outside the office windows, traffic moved peacefully through downtown, while my entire understanding of the last 3 years collapsed quietly inside me. Then Soren slid one final document across the desk. This one carried another title, Alma Torres Reading Room Fund. I looked up. What is this? Your wife drafted contingency plans, he explained. If coercion escalated beyond a certain point, future property interests could be redirected into a community literacy foundation instead of remaining within the family line. I blinked at him slowly. She wanted the house connected to children's reading programs? She said, Soren replied, while checking his notes, if the house ever stops being a home, let it still become something that teaches kindness. That sentence nearly destroyed me, because even preparing for betrayal, Alma still built something generous. I stared down at the paperwork for a long time. Then another thought hit me suddenly. Can this trust stop Brina completely? Soren's expression changed carefully. It can protect you, he said. But to enforce the strongest provisions cleanly, we need proof the pressure campaign began before the funeral. I thought immediately of Pilar, the permit requests, the SUV outside my house. Then another memory surfaced, the funeral home assistant, Omar Reyes. I remembered how uncomfortable he looked during the reception, how he kept glancing toward Brina whenever property discussions started. Soren closed the folder slowly. Ferran, he said quietly, your wife built a shield around you. I nodded faintly. But now, he continued, we need evidence showing exactly why she believed you would need it. At that exact moment, my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Then voicemail appeared immediately afterward. I pressed play. A nervous male voice spoke softly. Mr. Torres, this is Omar from the funeral home. I think there's something you need to know about the flower order your daughter-in-law placed before the service. By the time I got home from Soren Vale's office, the sun was already lowering behind the pecan trees along Magnolia Avenue. For a moment, everything looked normal. The porch swing Alma loved still moved slightly in the evening wind. The marigolds near the walkway glowed orange beneath the fading light. Somebody down the street was grilling onions and sausage, and the smell drifted through the neighborhood exactly the way it had every summer for decades. Ordinary life kept moving. That felt almost insulting. Then I noticed Mateo's truck in my driveway. My stomach tightened immediately. The front door wasn't fully closed when I stepped inside. Voices echoed faintly from the hallway. Brina first. No, donate these. Nobody keeps this many old cardigans. Mateo answered quietly. Maybe ask Dad before throwing things away. At least he said throwing things away instead of organizing now. The bar had fallen so low, I was almost grateful for crumbs. I walked into the living room slowly. 3 cardboard boxes sat near the fireplace. One was already labeled donation. Inside were Alma's sweaters, her gardening gloves, her favorite blue blanket from the reading chair near the window, and resting on top of everything else, her reading glasses. A white sticker had already been placed across the case. Discard. For a second, I genuinely couldn't breathe. Not because of the glasses themselves, because Alma wore those glasses every Saturday while helping neighborhood children practice reading in our living room. Tiny fingerprints from kids still smudged the corners half the time. And now somebody had reduced them to discard inventory before her side of the bed even turned cold. Brina appeared from the hallway carrying another box. "Oh," she said brightly, "we didn't know when you'd be back." I stared at the donation pile. You're cleaning out my wife. Her smile weakened slightly. We're trying to help before everything becomes emotionally overwhelming. There it was again. Help. Every cruel thing sounded softer after Brina polished the language around it. Matteo stepped closer. Dad, we just thought starting small might make things easier later. I looked directly at him. Your mother's glasses are in a donation box. He glanced down immediately. That told me everything. He hadn't even noticed. Brina set her box down carefully near the hallway. Ferran, she said in that same rehearsed tone, grief makes people cling to objects in unhealthy ways. I laughed once. Low, tired, empty. Objects? I repeated softly. Those objects taught half this neighborhood how to read. Neither of them answered, because neither of them truly understood the house. To Brina, it was property value. To Matteo, I wasn't sure anymore. Maybe guilt, maybe obligation, maybe inconvenience wrapped inside family language, but not memory, not history, not Alma. I walked past them toward the sewing room. The cabinet drawer was slightly open. Ice slid through my chest, instantly. Who touched this room? Brina folded her arms. We were checking for paperwork. Without asking me? We're trying to prevent future complications. I turned toward Matteo again. He looked exhausted now, not guilty enough to stop her, just tired enough to avoid conflict. That hurt worse somehow, because cruelty at least has conviction. Cowardice just watches. Then I noticed another box near the hallway closet. Inside were framed photographs from our living room walls. One picture showed Alma sitting cross-legged on the floor during a neighborhood reading day, while 6 children crowded around her holding library books. Another showed Matteo, at 12 years old, standing beside the marigolds after winning his middle school debate trophy. Brina had wrapped both frames in newspaper, like dishes from a garage sale. That was the moment my anger finally surfaced fully. Not loud, not explosive, cold, sharp, controlled. I stepped toward the boxes slowly. You are not packing this house while I'm still breathing inside it. Brina's face hardened for the first time since the funeral. Nobody said that? You didn't have to. Silence filled the room. Then Matteo spoke quietly. Dad, don't make this harder than it needs to be. The sentence landed like a knife, because it sounded exactly like Brina now. Not my son. Her. I looked at him for several long seconds before answering. You know what your mother feared most? Matteo swallowed, but said nothing. She didn't fear dying, I continued softly. She feared watching people turn love into logistics. Brina grabbed her purse suddenly. We're leaving, she snapped. Good. For once, honesty finally slipped through her voice. No more pretending this was compassion. Matteo hesitated near the front door before following her. For a brief second, I thought maybe he'd stay behind, maybe apologize, maybe look around the house and finally see what they were destroying. Instead, he lowered his eyes again and walked out beside his wife. The front door closed, and the silence afterward felt heavier than shouting. I stood alone in the living room for several minutes before noticing something outside near the hedges, a wooden stake partially hidden behind the bushes. I walked onto the porch slowly and pulled it free. A folded real estate yard sign. Coming soon. My knees nearly gave out. Not listed yet. Not public. Just waiting. Waiting for the right moment to be planted in the yard where Alma buried our old dog beside the marigolds 20 years earlier. I sat down hard on the porch steps, holding that sign across my lap. The evening air smelled like rain and cut grass. For the first time since the funeral, I cried. Not loudly, just the kind of quiet crying older men do after they finally realize the thing breaking them has already been happening for a long time. I looked toward the flower beds Alma planted by hand. Alma, I whispered, I buried you once already. I don't think I can survive watching them bury the rest of our life too. A small movement near the porch startled me then. Tape. Somebody had attached a handwritten note to the old reading shelf beside the front window. Probably one of the neighborhood kids. The paper read, Is Story Saturday still happening? That almost destroyed me all over again. Because even now, children still connected this house with kindness. Not money, not square footage. Kindness. My phone rang before I could stand up again. Unknown number. I answered weakly. A nervous voice spoke immediately. "Mr. Torres, this is Omar Reyes from the funeral home." I tightened my grip on the wooden sign. "There's something else I didn't tell you earlier," he said quietly. "Your daughter-in-law didn't order those funeral flowers only for the service." I felt cold instantly. "What do you mean?" Paper shuffled on his end of the call. Then Omar read one sentence aloud. "Use side arrangements later for property photos, if widow timing works." Everything inside me went still, because suddenly I understood the truth. They weren't planning around my future. They had been planning around Alma's death. I met Omar Reyes the following morning at a diner 2 blocks from the funeral home. The kind of place Alma used to love because the waitresses called everybody honey, whether they liked you or not. Rain tapped softly against the windows while exhausted people pushed eggs around their plates under fluorescent lights. Somewhere near the kitchen, an old country song played too quietly to identify. Omar already looked nervous before I even sat down. Mid-30s maybe, thin, polite. The kind of man who apologized with his eyes before his mouth caught up. He slid a manila envelope across the booth immediately. I copied these before anybody could remove them from the system. My hands felt strangely steady opening it. Inside were flower invoices, delivery confirmations, internal service notes, and printed email exchanges tied to Alma's funeral arrangements. Every page pulled another piece of illusion away. Omar lowered his voice. "At first, I thought maybe I misunderstood what your daughter-in-law meant." I looked up. "But then I heard her speaking with Kendra Moss in the parking lot after the service," he continued. "And it didn't sound like grief." Outside, rainwater crawled slowly down the diner windows while he handed me another document. One highlighted line read, "Hold floral side pieces for possible staging photos after service." Another note underneath, "Use after service if widow timing works." There it was again. Widow timing. Like my wife's death belonged on a project calendar. I stared at the words until they blurred. Omar rubbed both palms together nervously. "She also asked if the house still had natural lighting in the front room," he admitted. That's when I realized they weren't discussing memorial arrangements anymore. I closed the folder carefully, not because I was calm, because rage becomes dangerous once it finally turns cold. "Thank you," I told him quietly. Omar nodded once. "I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner." The truth was, he probably feared becoming involved in somebody else's family collapse. Most people do. That's why silence spread so easily around betrayal. After leaving the diner, I drove directly to Soren Vale's office. This time, he didn't seem surprised by anything I placed on his desk. Not the invoices, not the staging notes, not the funeral references tied to property language. He read every page carefully while rain hammered against the office windows downtown. Finally, he leaned back slowly. "This is coordinated behavior." The sentence landed heavily. Not family tension, not misunderstanding. Coordinated. Soren opened Alma's trust file again. Then he removed a sealed envelope I hadn't seen before. "She instructed me to wait until evidence escalated beyond suspicion before showing you this." My throat tightened immediately. Inside the envelope was a USB drive, the same one from the cedar box. Soren plugged it into his laptop silently. The video loaded after several seconds. Then Alma appeared on the screen. Alive. Weak, but alive. My entire chest collapsed inward the moment I heard her voice again. She sat in our living room, wearing the soft gray sweater she always used during treatment, because hospital blankets made her cold. The marigolds outside the window behind her looked freshly watered. For several seconds, she simply looked into the camera quietly. Then she smiled, sadly. "Ferran, if you're seeing this, then they spoke about the house before they properly honored our life together." I covered my mouth immediately. Even prepared grief still hurts when it suddenly speaks again. Alma continued softly. "I need you to listen carefully now, because once you know the truth, you will never be able to unknow it. The room around me disappeared. There was only her voice. I do not fear Brina's ambition as much as I fear Mateo's silence, she said quietly. Silence can stand beside cruelty long enough that eventually it starts protecting it. I shut my eyes hard, because deep down, I already knew she was right. The video continued. Do not argue with them emotionally. Do not scream. Do not beg for respect from people already calculating what grief might give them. Soren remained completely silent beside me. Alma reached slowly toward the camera like she wanted to touch my face through time itself. You built that home with your kindness, Farhan. Do not let anyone convince you kindness means surrender. I started crying then, not dramatically, just quietly, the way older men cry when the person who knew them best speaks one final truth nobody else could have delivered gently enough. Then Alma said something that changed the entire direction of my life. If the pressure continues, let the house become the reading room. I looked toward Soren immediately. He nodded once. The literacy fund. Alma smiled faintly in the video. If our family forgets what the house was meant for, let children remember instead. The screen faded to black after that. For several seconds I couldn't move. Soren finally spoke carefully. Your wife created legal contingencies tied to coercion. Based on the evidence now available, Brina can be removed from all future property interests connected to the trust. And Mateo? Soren's pause lasted too long. Suspension is possible, he admitted quietly. Potentially permanent if participation continues. Participation. Such a clean word for heartbreak. I stared out the rain-covered window toward the traffic below. My son never threatened me directly. No, Soren agreed. But silence beside manipulation still creates pressure. That sentence hurt because it was true. Mateo didn't become cruel. He became absent at the exact moment courage was required. And sometimes that damages people just as deeply. Soren closed the trust folder slowly. If you proceed formally, Farhan, this becomes irreversible. I nodded faintly. Then my phone vibrated. Talia. The message was short. Mom found out Grandma recorded something. She's panicking. Before I could answer, another message arrived immediately after. Grandpa, they're planning a family gathering at the church next week to discuss your future. I stared at the screen. Not because I was surprised anymore, because suddenly I understood exactly what Brina was trying to do. Public pressure, witnesses, sympathy language, controlled narrative, a performance. Soren noticed my expression immediately. What happened? I looked up slowly. They think they still control the room. And for the first time since Alma died, I realized they had no idea how much evidence my wife already left behind. The family gathering happened 8 days after Alma's funeral inside the fellowship hall at St. Mercy Chapel. Brina organized everything herself. Of course she did. There were folding tables covered with white cloth, coffee trays near the wall, store-bought pastries arranged carefully beside framed photos of Alma smiling at school reading events. To anyone walking in casually, it looked warm, respectful, loving. That was Brina's talent. She understood presentation better than sincerity. People from church arrived slowly, neighbors, former co-workers, a few relatives who still spoke about me like I was already halfway gone myself. Mateo stood beside Brina greeting people quietly while she controlled the room with soft smiles and lowered voices. Then I noticed Kendra Moss near the back wall, pretending to discuss flowers with someone from the choir. A realtor at a memorial gathering. That told me everything. Brina wasn't trying to help me grieve. She was building witnesses for a narrative. Poor elderly widower, large home, family concern, difficult transition. A story polished enough to make future guilt disappear. But this time, I didn't walk in alone. Soren Vale entered beside me carrying a leather folder. Behind him came Pilar Nunez, then Omar Reyes. Pastor Abel stepped away from the coffee station slowly when he saw us together. And finally, Talia walked in holding Alma's cedar box against her chest. Brina's smile vanished immediately. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough for me to finally see panic slip through the performance. "Farhan," she said carefully, "we were just starting." "I know," I answered calmly. "That's why I came." The room quieted gradually, as people noticed something shifting beneath the surface politeness. I walked to the center table and placed the cedar box down carefully beside Alma's framed photograph. Nobody spoke. Even Mateo looked unsettled now. Brina crossed her arms lightly. "What exactly is this?" I looked directly at her. "My wife's final lesson." Soren opened his folder without hurry. "Before any discussion regarding Mr. Torres's future living arrangements continues," he said evenly, "there are legal matters that need clarification." You could feel the room tightening around those words. Kendra Moss lowered her coffee cup slowly. Soren removed the trust documents first. "The Torres residence is protected under the Torres Home Preservation Trust, established in 2021. Brina blinked once. Mateo looked genuinely confused. Good. That meant she never told him everything either. Soren continued calmly. "The trust grants Farhan Torres permanent lifetime occupancy rights. Any attempt to pressure, manipulate, or accelerate property transfer through emotional coercion activates beneficiary suspension clauses." Silence spread across the hall. Not dramatic movie silence. The uncomfortable kind. Forks stopping halfway to plates. People avoiding eye contact. Someone quietly setting down a coffee cup too carefully. Brina recovered quickly. "We're not coercing anyone," she said smoothly. "We've only been trying to help Farhan make safe decisions." That word again. Safe. Pilar stood up before Soren could answer. "No," she said sharply. "You started measuring the property while Alma was still alive." Every head turned toward her instantly. Brina's face tightened. Pilar continued without hesitation. "I saw the survey man outside the house 11 days before Alma died. And I heard you discussing widow timing on the phone." Mateo looked toward Brina immediately. Not angry yet. Confused. That was new. Omar stepped forward next. His hands shook slightly while he handed papers to Pastor Abel. "These are copies from the funeral home records," he said quietly. Pastor Abel adjusted his glasses and read aloud. "Hold floral side arrangements for property photos if widow timing works." The entire room froze. One older woman near the dessert table slowly pulled the casserole dish she brought farther away from Brina's side of the table without saying a word. That tiny movement somehow carried more judgment than shouting ever could. Kendra Moss tried stepping quietly toward the exit. Soren noticed immediately. "Please stay, Ms. Moss," he said calmly. "Your email correspondence is also relevant." Brina's composure finally cracked. "This is insane," she snapped. "We were trying to protect the family's future." I looked at her for several seconds before answering. "No," I said quietly. "You were trying to sell the room where my wife taught children how to read." Nobody defended her, not even Mateo. That silence hit differently now, because for the first time, he understood what his silence had helped build. Then Talia stepped forward holding the cedar box. Her hands trembled slightly. "Grandma recorded something," she whispered. Pastor Abel dimmed the fellowship hall lights while Soren connected the USB drive. And suddenly, Alma appeared alive again on the projector screen at the front of the room. The entire hall stopped breathing. Alma looked tired in the video. Thin, fragile. Fragile, but her eyes remained steady. "If you are watching this," she said softly, "then somebody spoke about the house before they honored the life inside it." Nobody moved, not even Brina. Alma continued, "I do not fear greed as much as I fear silence standing beside greed." Mateo lowered his head immediately. Then came the sentence that shattered him completely. "If my son says nothing while someone pressures Farhan, do not mistake that silence for innocence." Mateo covered his mouth instantly. For the first time since the funeral, he looked ashamed instead of defensive. Alma's video ended quietly a few moments later. No dramatic music, no threats, just truth. The lights came back on slowly. Brina looked around the room desperately, like she expected somebody to rescue her version of events. Nobody did, because evidence destroys performance faster than emotion ever can. Soren closed the folder carefully. "Effective immediately," he announced. "Brina Torres is removed from all future property interests connected to the trust. Any continued coercive activity will trigger permanent exclusion measures." Brina stared at him in disbelief. "And Mateo?" she asked sharply. Soren looked toward my son. "Current beneficiary status is suspended pending corrective action and acknowledgement of participation." Participation. There was that word again. Mateo finally looked at me fully then. Not at the floor, not at Brina, at me. "Dad," he whispered weakly. "I didn't know it had gone this far." I answered him honestly. "You knew enough to speak up." That hurt him. I could see it immediately. Good. Some pain arrives late because truth takes time catching up to cowardice. People started leaving quietly after that. Not chaos, just discomfort. Reality settling over a room that had been carefully staged for something else. As Brina grabbed her purse angrily, Pastor Abel stopped her gently near the doorway. "One more thing," he said. She turned impatiently. Pastor Abel pointed toward Alma's photograph near the cedar box. "You never once spoke about her today," he said softly. "Only the house." Brina didn't answer, because there was nothing left to defend. An hour later, after nearly everyone had gone home, Mateo remained alone near the fellowship hall entrance. Rain tapped softly outside again. He looked smaller somehow, older, like consequences had finally reached him. "Dad," he said quietly, "if I leave Brina, can I still come home?" I stared at my son for a very long time before answering, and in that moment, I realized something heartbreaking. Just because someone was born inside a house doesn't mean they still know how to belong there. 8 months after Alma's funeral, the house felt alive again. Not the same. It would never be the same, but alive. Every Saturday morning, children started arriving around 9, carrying backpacks, library books, and half-finished homework assignments. Some came because their apartments were too loud. Some because their parents worked weekends. A few just liked the old pecan tree in the backyard, and the hot chocolate I learned to make badly after Alma passed. The living room became the Alma Torres reading room, exactly the way she imagined it. Nothing fancy, just folding chairs, old shelves, community donations, storybooks stacked beside history textbooks, the same reading lamp Alma used for 30 years, still glowing near the window every weekend. And somehow, the house stopped feeling haunted after that. Grief changes shape when purpose enters the room. Pilar volunteered almost every Saturday. Mostly, she pretended to supervise children while secretly gossiping with neighborhood parents near the kitchen. "The curtains retired," she liked saying. "Now, I monitor chaos directly." Even Pastor Abel started bringing books people donated through the church. Sometimes I would stand quietly near the hallway and watch children reading aloud, where Mateo once practiced debate speeches with Alma, listening proudly from the sofa. That hurt. But it healed, too. Funny how both things can exist together once you get old enough. Brina disappeared from our lives almost completely after the church gathering. The Realtor Board opened an ethics investigation into Kendra Moss shortly afterward. I never followed the details closely. Revenge stops feeling satisfying after a certain age, mostly because peace becomes more valuable than punishment. As for Mateo, that part took longer. 3 months after the trust suspension, he mailed me a handwritten letter instead of texting. Not excuses, not manipulation. Just honesty for the first time in years. He admitted he kept choosing silence because confronting Brina felt harder than disappointing me. He said somewhere along the way he confused avoiding conflict with being kind. That sentence stayed with me a long time. Because many people destroy relationships exactly that way. Not through cruelty, through cowardice disguised as peacekeeping. I did not invite him home immediately. Love without boundaries becomes permission. Alma understood that before I did. So I wrote Mateo back with conditions. Public accountability. 1 year volunteering at the reading room, counseling. No discussions about property while I'm alive. And one final rule: do not ask forgiveness before you learn how to protect people while they are still hurting. He accepted every condition. That mattered more than apologies. Some Saturdays now, Mateo quietly helps children shelve books in the living room. He rarely speaks much when he's here. The shame still lives inside him. I can see it every time he looks at Alma's photograph near the reading shelf. But shame can either bury a person or rebuild one. I suppose time eventually decides which direction people choose. One afternoon, not long ago, I found Talia sitting on the porch steps watering Alma's marigolds. She smiled softly and asked, "Grandpa, do you think Grandma knew this place would become all this?" I looked through the front window at the children reading inside the house Alma fought to protect. Then I noticed the cedar box sitting on the bookshelf near the entrance, not hidden anymore, displayed, beside a small framed quote in Alma's handwriting: "A home should shelter people, not expose their greed." I smiled for the first time that entire week. She knew enough, I told Talia quietly. The truth is, I still love my son. That never stopped. But love changes once you finally understand that protecting your peace is not the same thing as abandoning your family. Sometimes the most loving thing an older parent can do is stop rewarding behavior that slowly destroys everyone around it. The house will never belong to Brina. And after I'm gone, it won't pass automatically to Mateo either. If the reading room stays active for 5 consecutive years after my death, the property becomes a permanent non-profit literacy space for local children. If not, the house will be sold, and every dollar will fund scholarships in Alma's name. Either way, the home she built will continue teaching kindness long after I'm gone. I think she would have liked that ending. Sometimes I still sit alone on the porch at night, listening to the neighborhood settle into silence. Wind through the pecan branches, distant traffic, sprinklers clicking across nearby lawns. And every now and then, I swear I can still hear Alma turning book pages inside the house. Maybe grief never fully leaves. Maybe it simply learns how to sit beside gratitude without speaking so loudly anymore. Thank you for spending this time with me today, and for listening to Alma's story through mine. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are tonight. And wherever life has taken you, please take care of your health, your peace, and the people who truly protect your dignity when you are vulnerable. If this story moved you even a little, don't forget to subscribe to Final Act Revenge. Another story is waiting for you on your screen right now, and YouTube believes you may enjoy that one too.